The next thing that we think about when building models is that we have to understand that the model itself drives all the functionality of the entire Looker. It's sort of the core, and we have to design it in reference to all of the people who are using it. So we have to make sure our analysts, our explorers, and our consumers understand what they're looking at. I don't know if anyone does this, but none of us should ever just generate a model and keep all the columns names the same if those column names suck. We want to make them pretty. So the model is the skeleton of the Looker. It drives all our API requests, all of our saved queries, all of our reports, all of our scheduled tasks, everything. So anytime you make a change, you want to make sure that you're careful with the model, the view, and the fields, and the explorers. Those are the core objects that lives in the model that drives all of those other functionalities. So skeletons evolve over time.
Some people believe.
Some people might find this controversial. So over time, our business is going to get better at collecting data. We're going to get better at understanding our business model. And hopefully, we'll become better at making money and operate as a business. So our skeletons will change. However, not all change is good. So here's some x-rays of dislocated skeletons. And you can see I think the one with the elbow is less than an inch of movement, but the muscle can't work anymore. There's blood vessels that are being constricted. It really, really hurts because all the nerves are pressurized and they're firing all the time. And this happens in Looker too. It hurts. So this error is the #1 error we receive in our chat support, which is unknown or inaccessible field referenced. Whenever I pop on chat, I have in my bookmarks the link to how to solve for this error. So I could really quickly give it to someone. But it really happens, because usually we re-alias a view or redefine a field, and we forget, we have explorers that are using that field, or we have other views that are using that field. And this can cause some pretty big problems. There's some triage for this. There's a not so well-known feature called the alias parameter. And so if you rename a field, you can alias that field to another namespace, and then all your URLs and everything in Looker will try to search through that whole array of the namespace to make sure that still works. This triaging doesn't actually work for the model or the explorers or the views. So when you try to rename those objects, you get 404s. And this can break a lot of things. So how do we solve for this? Now that we know that the model is the skeleton of our Looker, it's really important to plan out your model before you start running away and building with it. You want to look at all of your different tables that are available in the connection. You want to make sure that from those tables, you know what the use cases are from now and going forward. And that will give you an idea of what explorers you'll need, what views you'll need, what kind of PDTs or derived tables you'll need. It's sort of a roadmap to what your model's future is in comparison to today. And that will save you a lot of pain.
So many of you have seen the movie Lost in Translation. Anyone? Yeah? I did not. I have not seen it. I did Wikipedia it yesterday, though, and one of the kind of recurring themes in the movie is getting lost in translation. Shocker.
Spoiler.
Yeah, right? Sorry for those of you that haven't seen it. And one of the things Lloyd mentioned earlier today is that LookML is meant to be a language, and it's actually meant to be a language that helps you express your data to your end users, providing that translation layer. And working on the customer success team, one of the things that we hear a lot from our customers is, how do I get my business users involved? How do I get them excited? How do I engage them? How do I create an engaging Looker deployment? And it really starts with that translation layer. It starts with taking the data, taking the building blocks, taking those bones, and starting to put an appearance on the front end. We're going to kind of further this analogy. But it's like plastic surgery, right? You want to put a face to it that they recognize, that they like, that they enjoy, that they want to come into and play with, and is familiar to them. And when I first started at Looker, we didn't necessarily have all of these parameters that helped you curate that experience for your end users, but we started to add them as we saw people kind of struggle with that appearance and give you guys the ability to create something more friendly. So again, as Mike mentioned, there's no need to change those field names, use your aliases. But if you want to start to curate that front end a little bit, we have parameters like labels. Again, that's that translation. So taking something like inventory item ID and turning it into something like inventory info or something like that. Additionally, which I'll go into detail on, we have view labels. This allows you to curate and kind of create contextual groupings of your fields. That way users kind of understand how they relate to the business and give you more context there. And then finally, we have descriptions. So each field can have a description parameter added to it where you can put an entire string of text, giving them, when they hover over that field in the Explorer, a little bit of information on how to use it, what it means to the business, and that's a really, really great way for them to get a little bit more familiar with your building blocks, your KPIs, and your metrics.
Right, yeah, and I think the driving, for why people don't do this, usually the driving cause is, they're renaming the wrong things, essentially. They're renaming those model objects that Mike was talking about for the sake of changing how it looks on the front end, which creates kind of like an awkward situation. And so I think that's kind of like the underlying concept here is that that model and the model object should be friendly to the developers and should be recognizable to the developers. And then the labels are really good ways to actually abstract what the underlying database looks like for the front end user and make it more business friendly.
Yep. Exactly. So what does this look like in practice? So kind of furthering Talal's example, imagine that users view with the other users' tables normalized. So we have a user's profile, user fact, user address. To a developer, this is important, right? You need to know these tables. You need to know how they relate. You need to join them together. To your end users, users are just users. I don't really know what the profile has to do with the address, has to do with their facts and any other derived tables or any other derived columns that you create for them. So for them, why not create a view label, group them all into users, something that's familiar for them, and groups them as such. So that's one example there. That's applied, again, at the join level. So when you're joining views in together, you can group them as such. Another way to accomplish this is with individual fields. And so the same way when you're working with dimension groups in Looker for time frames, we have week, month, year, day of week, quarter was added a bunch of releases ago. You can do the same concept. You can start to group your fields into logical groupings that make sense. So if you have a bunch of fields that relate to a user's address, group them as such, allow them to kind of collapse or expand that when they need to access those fields. And again, that's a little bit more recognizable to them. And so we can do a little kind of in the plastic surgery, right, the before and after images. So this is what that would Explorer look like beforehand. We see, again, everything's kind of grouped into their different views. But once we apply those labels, we now see that everything kind of collapses under users. They can expand or collapse that or and also go into the addresses as well, and then expand that into each of the fields that relate to the address for the user. So in that experience there, for them to kind of get familiar with the fields that are recognizable to them, it's a much better place to start.
Right, and this is especially important when I'm bringing my users, that users Explorer into other Explorers that might already have 4 or 5 different views built into them, because then the number of views you're starting to see there on the left in the groupings, again, back to the idea of like having that cognitive load, you're just seeing so many different versions of it, you don't know exactly where to turn your eye.
Right. So the other example of this is if you're working with event data, if you have a really, really wide table with many, many fields. Each of those fields could relate to something about that event, the ID, the browser where that event was fired, the city, the country where that person or that device was from, information about the latitude, the longitude, or even the device itself, like its operating system. In this example, what we'd want to do is instead put the view labels onto the fields themselves, but again, create that grouping so on the front end, to the end user, they now have a way to look at all of the event data, all of the location data for that event, all of the device data for that event. And so we'll see that before and after again here. A lot of you probably have experienced kind of the infinite scroll effect of Looker, where there's just so many fields, right? This is an attempt to kind of solve for that, and again, kind of collapse things into something that's more recognizable to the user, the device, the events, the location, telling you something about those events, again, making it a little bit more familiar to them, a little bit easier to navigate. All of this is kind of, again, in line with creating that translation layer, creating an experience for the users to come in, to see things that are familiar, to see the naming, the context, and the descriptions of fields and things that they're used to that they talk about. And so when you're working with them, hearing the way they describe fields, hearing the way that they work with their data is important, because you're using that to kind of, again, create that translation. So I had to add this slide. When we were working on this presentation, I couldn't help but think, between the building blocks and the bones and the surgery, I couldn't help but think of Frankenstein. And if you know the story of Frankenstein, you can create a lot in Looker, right? And we don't want people necessarily creating really scary, awful beasts like Frankenstein. We want you guys to create a really great experience, something that is friendly, familiar, and awesome. And so if you heed these advices, hopefully you won't have a data Frankenstein on your hand.